Good afternoon. My tentative title of my presentation is Mourning as Politics in the Time of the Pandemic. And what I want to do in my paper is to call for the analysis of emotion as part of political life and a site of contestation by the Kenyan colonial state. Just to remind us that a pandemic is not only a physical experience, it's also an emotional one. We expect to be worried about our loved ones and about our survival, to be perplexed about how vital our bodies are, and yet we are helpless over them and what they do. It's also a time when we expect to be joyful in moments with loved ones and to grieve the loss of those whom the disease afflicts. In other words, when there's a pandemic, we are looking towards a very emotional experience, which is determined by the social. However, these social and emotional dynamics were not taken into account when we were responding to the pandemic. Some of the things we saw, of course, which have been mentioned in earlier presentations, was the use of violence to control the curfew, the inequalities in healthcare that became visible. So all these were circumstances that interfered, I would say, with our emotional experience of a very trying time. I want to propose that we need to include emotional life when we're examining political life as well. So I'm going to analyze the ambiguities we saw using the framework of Arlie Hochschild's concept of emotional labor, which I discussed last time I was here. Emotional labor, she says, is the work we have to do on our emotions to produce the expectations or the expressions required by institutions. Emotional labor is a painful process of what Foucault called governmentality, because one has to manage the self within the institution by managing one's own feelings. To understand why this process is so alienating, we need to remember the role of emotions. Emotions, Hochschild argues, are our immediate censors. They give us clues about what we are observing. So, for example, someone might speak to us loudly, but it is our emotions which are able to tell if the person is speaking loudly because they are speaking from a noisy place or if they are being rude. Our emotions, she argues, gives us access to our subconscious also because they alert us that our reactions may be based on a previous experience that we have not quite processed. To put it simply, we need our emotions to apprehend reality, just like we need our 5 other senses. Without emotion, Hochschild argues, a person has no warning system, no guidelines to the self-relevance of a sight, a memory, or a fantasy. An emotionless person is similar to a person whose nerves are dead and therefore puts the hand in the fire and does not feel their hand burn. Such a person, Hochschild says, becomes arbitrary and ironically irrational. This means that our emotions were supposed to be crucial in guiding us through the pandemic. A response to the pandemic required acknowledging Kenyans' anxieties about the new disease and the impact on the lockdowns on their incomes and the grief people would feel at losing their loved ones, and the general angst about that comes with disruptions of our lives in a socially insecure country like Kenya. The importance of ritual, and especially funeral rites, could not be minimized. However, I need to offer a word of caution. Talking about the importance of emotions does not mean that the actions should be taken directly from emotion. Rather, it is society, through culture, arts, ritual, and institutions, which guide us on how to articulate how we feel and how to express what we feel, and the extent to which emotions guide how we act. And that is the problem I'd like to address here. I'm going to refer to E.S. Atieno Odhiambo's famous article on the ideology of order, and where he argues that Kenyans are burdened with a state and their institutions which impose an anti-human logic which sees people and their democratic will as a threat to stability and order. As a result, the state's main preoccupation is to suppress the people's voice, which it does through the instruments of the presidency, bureaucracy, and the security forces, which we saw in the curfews which were imposed due to the pandemic. So the state asserts its control by using force to eliminate bodies, and what he said is that they use assassinations, and they control the agenda, and they control the debate. So the part that most people do not talk about, and which I think is what we in the arts should be discussing, is the emotional aspect of these tools of control. So, for example, he says that assassinations are preferred not simply to get rid of the person who is a nuisance, but because of their dramatic effect. They are clinically and surgically neat, in his words, because they are dramatic and final. So the impact of the elimination is overwhelming, not simply to the victim who is taken out, but also to the survivors who have to deal with the extreme use of force and the finality of death. And then I've talked about the second form of control, which is speech. And speech is how we express our emotions. So if speech is controlled, then we can't express the emotions we feel. And one can also add that the study of the arts, especially in our school system, is part of helping people deal with their emotions. And unfortunately, we are witnessing the whittling down of the arts, and most recently, we've seen in the University of Nairobi. But fast forward to the pandemic, what happened was that the state behaved true to character and ordered our emotional life. Rather than see the pandemic as an affliction on human beings, the state persisted in seeing the people as a threat to power, just the way Atieno Odhiambo says. So it was not the virus that was threatening people's lives. Rather, it was a virus threatening the state's control of people's lives. The state's focus was not on the health of the people, but on the control of the people. Within 6 months of the first curfew, 15 people were dead from police brutality. And as Boniface Mwangi would be quoted as saying, COVID is the unseen killer, but the police are the seen killers. What Mwangi's words do is that they refer us to the use of terror to manage people, and the extent the state uses violence to become a more immediate fear than COVID itself. In the battle against COVID, the state actually won control over the lives of the poor. And this is the horror we have been subjected to, most recently with the case of the Kianjokoma brothers. This case was not the first, but it was the most shocking, and it was the first time the state rushed to manage the outpouring of outrage and grief. But let me just go back. One of the things that people of literature need to be concerned about is the administration's use of public relations as the site for managing the pandemic. The hiring of a PR expert to manage the government's response to the pandemic through the Ministry of Health was significant. It indicated that what mattered was not our health, but how we feel about the government and how the government looks. The bulk of the lectures we got from the Ministry of Health need a really close analysis, because I haven't been able to go through them, but my suspicion is an analysis will reveal that there was an obsession with controlling personal behavior through moralistic lectures, where Kenyans were treated like the threat to health rather than the people whose health was threatened. I'm going to read one example to illustrate my concern. I'm going to talk about the fate of Dr. Stephen Mogusu, who was a doctor who died from COVID in December 2020. Dr. Mogusu became the symbol of all that is wrong with the healthcare system and with the contempt for healthcare as work or as labor. Just to remind us of the details, Dr. Mogusu was a doctor who was hired on contract to work during a pandemic. He was born as the only son to a poor family. He was brilliant and passed well enough to join medical school, where he graduated. When he contracted COVID, he had not been paid for 5 months and he had no insurance. His father walked around the village to raise funds to pay the deposit to the hospital, while the doctors made a fundraising appeal for their colleague. As Dr. Mogusu was dying, he WhatsApped a message telling his fellow colleagues to get their pay and leave their jobs with their health intact. He left behind a widow and a 5-month-old child and a 200,000 hospital bill. The details of this story, as you can imagine, are absurd. It's such a useless waste of life and potential, and Dr. Mogusu knew it and said as much. But it was not COVID that killed him, but the circumstances in which he contracted the disease. But even before Kenyans, especially the doctors, had time to grieve over the death of a young man and the promise he held, the public was treated to insensitivity from our public relations officer and other government officials. The governor of Machakos, the county in which Dr. Mogusu worked, rushed to wash his hands of the payment problems, while the Ministry of Health promised to settle the bill of Dr. Mogusu and other medical workers who died from COVID. In other words, they were looking forward to medical workers dying from COVID rather than looking forward to protecting workers. The doctors planned to go on strike to fight for better protection and working conditions, and the insensitivity of the political class went up a notch. The former Prime Minister castigated the doctors for holding Kenya at a ransom, telling doctors that, I quote, "It is not only doctors who are dying," unquote. But the more insensitive response came from the CS of Health. In an interview 2 weeks later, the CS had not even mastered Dr. Mogusu's name and referred to him as the doctor. He said, and I quote, because it's so surprising to me, he said, I quote, "We have had other doctors pass away, unfortunately, and I'm afraid it is in the realm of things, and you can expect that other health workers, like other Kenyans, may pass away. And they are doing so all over the world every day. Unfortunately, it is unfortunate," unquote. He then abruptly shifted to accusing the doctors of taking advantage and I quote, "creating emotion out of a circumstance that they have not quite understood," unquote. The circumstances that needed to be explained, he went to tell us, were the numbers of doctors hired and their pay. And then he again returned to the doctors and said that we need to, quote, "separate the issue of genuine mourning and genuine feelings from the issue of using a young man's death for union political purposes. It is disgusting, really," unquote. One has to pause for a moment at this hubris. Why does emotion need to be created when somebody dies, and dies so unfairly? Is death not drastic enough to mourn? Who else would better know the plight of Dr. Mogusu than the doctors who went to school with him and were struggling to raise the hospital fees at the last minute? What the CS was really doing was to use state power to dictate how Kenyans should express their feelings. In other words, they were demanding a certain emotional labor from Kenyans. What the CS calls, quote, "genuine mourning and genuine feelings," unquote, is essentially a demand for feelings that do not lead Kenyans to challenge the state and question the politics that surround their circumstances. But more importantly, their CS was asserting the order of things, the ideology of order that Odhiambo was talking about. The state must keep control of the country, and people dying is part of that order. And when they do die, people may mourn as long as they do not disrupt the political order, which was the CS's job to guard. And this brings me to the issue of what mourning is, and it is directly related to the issue of radical joy. Mourning is a political act. It is an act of resistance. To quote Maurice Wallace, mourning is a refusal of injustice. It is a refusal of apathy. It is also an affirmation of life. Mourning is an act where we say that the human life that has gone matters. And if it matters enough, it means that we should prevent the circumstances which are leading to the loss of that life, if those circumstances can be affected by our social and political action. What I'm saying in a nutshell is that, first of all, we need to recognize that mourning is an act of joy. It's a radical act of joy because we are affirming the life that is lost. And the capacity to mourn, if it is a human endeavor, we need to understand how the state is interrupting and disrupting our capacity to mourn and demanding emotional labor that coincides with their desire for control. The second thing is that we need to name our emotion, and we need to resist misnaming of the emotion for purposes of the colonial order. And in this case, I'm referring to the fact that after Dr. Mogusu died, there was a headline saying that he sacrificed his life for us, basically turning what was an injustice into a mode of salvation. And then, as I've said, that mourning is a refusal of indifference, and that goes beyond the emotional and the philosophical. It urges us to change the circumstances in which the cause of death is social rather than natural. And this is what the doctors were doing, and that was what they were blasted for. I'm challenging us, especially the people in literature, not to give up our space to public relations, because public relations weaponizes emotion for the state. We need to reclaim the use of emotion as a nerve for the people, which they use in their interactions in daily life. Thank you very much.